So we are still in lesson 2, which we were working on last week. Lesson 2, which is that lesson that does not say lesson 2 on top. I'm sorry. And we're talking some here from Deuteronomy chapter 4 through 6, which will be our class for the next couple of weeks. And the lesson last week, we're kind of working into some points about grace, and that's where we're going today. And as we said last week, we'd finish up that lesson today, and maybe we get into the next one. We'll see how much discussion we have here today and where we go with that. Glad you're here this morning. As we begin, we're going to begin with a prayer, and James Mosley is going to lead us here as we start.
Our Father in heaven, we're grateful for the time that we can be together as Christians, and we can open your word and study from it. Pray that this time that we spend in your word is beneficial this morning and according to your word. In Jesus' name, amen.
Amen. So in this quarter, as we study through the book of Deuteronomy, it's not necessarily a chapter by chapter study, though Ben started out chapters 1 through 3 doing kind of an introduction, and then we're taking up in chapters 4 through 6. We may not be going just in a chronological way as we go through. We're doing some more subject type studies. Like in chapters 4 through 6, as I've been studying through there, I see 3 things that stand out to me a lot is God's grace, the need of obedience, and the need to hear and teach what God says. And those are the 3 points that I'm kind of keying in on as we look at chapters 4 through 6. Well, there's some other things to be said too, but those are the ones that I'm trying to really look at. And so last week, as we got started in this portion of the text, we tried to think about what was going through the mind of Moses as he's coming to his last days. He has these more final words to say to the children of Israel. And, what was he thinking about? And, thinking about the failed attempt 40 years earlier to go into the land. And that didn't work because of their lack of faith. And so this is kind of the backstory. This tells us what has been going on and bringing us to this point. And so we think about what was Moses hoping for the children of Israel here. Well, he was hoping they would listen to him because he was delivering God's will to them. And nothing new. We said before, we're not plowing new ground here. He's reviewing with them the events that have taken place and things that God has already said. But what he was hoping was that they would listen and that they would respond to that. And his concerns, I think very clear in the first part of chapter 4. His concerns is that they would turn away, just like they did worshiping the Baal of Peor and some of the other instances of sin in the wilderness. And so he's making that clear. He's reminding them, you remember what happened when you did this and when you did that. His concern is that they would do that again. And so if we even try to put ourselves in the place of these people, and as they approach the promised land, what were they thinking? They're thinking about the sins of the past. They're thinking about how the attempt to enter didn't work before and all the reasons behind that. And so this is all of that backstory there. And what is very clear to us is that the problem was their unfaithfulness is what kept them from going into the land before. That was the problem, and that was the issue. But 40 years have passed. In fact, there's many who died in the wilderness because of those sins. All the more the reason for those who were there and remembered, prior to the wilderness to tell the stories of the fathers. And that's part of the emphasis of Moses, to tell these things, to teach your children and your grandchildren so these same mistakes don't happen again. 40 years has passed, and here we are, about to go into the promised land. The opportunity is there. And when we start thinking about God's place and God's position in this, what I've thought about is God's grace is still there. He is still giving them the opportunity to enter in. Though they had failed so miserably 40 years before, and even during the period of the wilderness wandering, still there were times where they stumbled and they fell down. God is still saying they can enter into the promised land. And so God's grace is still great, and he has not forgotten Israel. Now, to be fair with you, I'm not sure I'd have been so gracious. I mean, at what point would I have just said to Israel, I'm through with you. I'm finished. You understand what I'm saying? But here God is still saying, here's the key to the kingdom. Here's what you need to go in. And so thinking about their experiences of the last 40 years, they're called to remember God's words and his promises, and that those promises are still there. Those promises are still true. And so these events are a reminder, I think, a reminder of God's grace. The events of the last 40 years, and even those who go beyond, it's a reminder of God's grace, his mercy, his love for his people. Even though there were times when his people did not love him so much. And we say, well, how do we know they didn't love God? Well, they didn't listen to him. They didn't obey him. This gives us an indication that there were times that their love was not what it needed to be. They were unfaithful to him. And so what's required to enter into the promised land is the same that was required 40 years earlier. That hasn't changed. And so as we look through chapter 4 last week, we can see the very passionate plea, the pleas of Moses for the people to listen, to obey, and to be able to enter into the land. The last part of chapter 2, there are some questions and some points of discussion for us that we'll spend some time with today, trying to consider God's grace. You know, often when we think about God's grace, I'm afraid that we think of that as a New Testament kind of a matter. In fact, I've heard people say that. You know, I've heard people say such things as, well, when we look at the Old Testament and we see the nature and character of God, we see his fury, we see his anger, we see his judgment. But in the New Testament, we see God's grace. Is that an accurate description of what we see in the Old Testament and New Testament?
Yes, but not exclusively.
Okay. All right. Well, explain that just a little more.
Well, his patience with Israel is certainly an example of his graciousness to them.
Yes.
His long suffering and patience.
Right. Right. You know, it's true in the New Testament, we see the word grace a whole lot more than we do in the Old Testament. I mean, I get that. I understand that. And we see God's grace demonstrated in the most incredible way in sending his son. God's grace and mercy is certainly demonstrated in that way. They offer the hope that we have of salvation, the opportunity to enter the promised land. We see the parallel. But for us to not think that God's grace is demonstrated in the Old Testament is to really miss an important part of the story. I would suggest to you God's grace is just as strong and just as powerful in the Old Testament as it is in the New Testament. We see it there. We see it all through the Old Testament. And I'm afraid sometimes that escapes us. I mean, I understand. We read about God's grace in some different ways in the New Testament, and it stands out in such a powerful way. But I think it stands out just as powerfully in the Old Testament, and the stories that are unfolded there, and God's love for his creation is demonstrated over and over again, and he provides a means for his people to stand before him right. We see that all through the Old Testament. And if we try to narrow it back down again, because as I said before, we're trying to stay right here in Deuteronomy 4, 5, and 6. You talk about God's grace, there's a lot of other places we can go. I get that. But if we're just looking at Deuteronomy 4, 5, and 6, can we see God's grace? That's what I want us to look at.
Well, can I make the point that we don't go even 6 chapters into the Old Testament until we see the statement that Noah found grace?
Exactly. Exactly. Right. Absolutely.
I think in the New Testament, it's easy for us to point to the cross as the singular event. It's really easy to say, say there's one tremendous display of grace. But in the Old Testament, you can point to hundreds of different examples that are just not so obvious.
Right.
So maybe that's part of the issue.
Exactly. I think it is. And that's why I wanted us to kind of just slow down here just a little bit. And just look at this text, and can we see and understand there's a demonstration of God's grace here that is very strong and very powerful.
Okay, remember when, after they made the golden calf, and God said, okay, I'm gonna wipe you off.
Right.
And Moses pleaded for him.
Right.
I can't help you, I'm going to. That's not very kind of what it is.
Exactly. And so you see that there are so many ways where we do see God's grace demonstrated in the Old Testament. I don't think this is a minor point. I think this is important for us to see and to understand that this is the nature of God, that he is a loving and gracious God. Does he make judgment? Yes. Is he a jealous God? Chapter 4 says yes. Does God expect obedience from his people? Yes. We cannot minimize any of these things, and yet what rises above all of this is God's grace, where he's saying, come to me, come to me. That's always there and that's present. If we will obey him, he is there. Sarah.
I just don't think it's given a name as often in the Old Testament
That's
as
right.
it is in the New Testament. And, yes, all of this is inspired by God, but if you think about the time and how language changes over time, like different, even amongst our generations here that are present, the way that people talked when some of you were young versus when people talk now
Sure.
is different. And
Sure.
it's not that God has changed, it's just style.
This is a point that I want us to see, that God has not changed.
Right. Just
When
the
we
way
come-
talk is-
When we come to the New Testament dispensation, it's not a new God. It's the same God. And his grace is just as great in the Old Testament period of time as in the New, demonstrated a little bit different way. Joe? Oh, okay. All right. Good. Yeah, Jeff.
Just to go off what Sarah said, I think, in the Old Testament, if you would equate the word promise with grace.
Yes,
That's the Old Testament word for grace,
sure.
promise. And then you see it hundreds of times.
Yeah, okay, good point. Yeah, just a good point. The word promise in the Old Testament very often can be looked at, equated to grace. So you see, to look at and to study the Old Testament story helps us to see so much about the character of God and to understand how he would want us to approach him, and for us to understand how approachable he is, even by his grace. Looking at chapter 4 again, Deuteronomy chapter 4. When we think about what we can see and understand about the character of God and what we already know about God's grace, what are some conclusions that we might draw from chapter 4 that help to demonstrate God's grace? And I'll give you a clue, verse 1. If you look at Deuteronomy 4 and verse 1, what might we see as a demonstration of God's grace?
He gave them land.
He gave the land. He's giving them the land. It's the same thing, it's the same promise that was made 40 years ago that he is giving. He said, this is the land that I'm giving you. Go in and conquer the land. Take the land that I am giving you. Which in part has to be the disappointment of God 40 years prior when he has told them, I'm giving you the land. Here's what you have to do. It'll be yours. And their faith is not enough to take them there. But here again, 40 years later, the requirements are the same. But he is going to give them the land if they'll do what he says and go in. I think that's a demonstration of God's grace. Did they deserve the land? I'm not thinking so. They had failed to do what God said before. And even if they had done everything that God had wanted them to do, does that make them deserve it? I'm not seeing that. It's God's gift to them. He's giving it to them. Calvin, you got it?
God's warning to them in this chapter of idolatry, reminded them of what happened at Mount Sinai. They had not seen his likeness, and they ended up building the calf. And he warns them again of this, and then he tells them that he's the God that brought them out of the iron furnace, out of Egypt.
Yeah.
And what greater expression of grace and mercy could there be?
Sure.
And just the term that he uses there of their captivity during that time in Egypt as an iron furnace.
Mm-hmm.
And he was gracious and brought them out of that.
Mm-hmm.
And cared for them.
Absolutely. Again, demonstration of his grace, how he took them, how he saved them from the iron furnace, from captivity, from Egypt, and brought them away. How he portrayed himself and proved to them that he was their God at Mount Sinai. And how, if you remember at Mount Sinai in Exodus chapter 19, you know, how they didn't even want to talk to God. Moses, go talk to God for us. And Moses came back and delivered God's word. And they said to Moses at that time to tell God, we will do everything he says. Remember? And it seemed that they were so ready to be God's people. And yet just 40 days later, they're worshiping the calf. And God was angry. He's a jealous God, Deuteronomy 4 tells us. He was angry. He was ready to destroy the people. But only through the pleading of Moses did God save them. He was gracious to them again and spared them. Ronnie?
I don't know, maybe as you mentioned, I missed it, but verse 8 raises the question about what great nation is there that has such statutes and righteousness and judgments as are in all this law, which I set before you this day. So the special nature of this nation in their relationship with God was an act of grace.
Absolutely.
He picked them out as a special
That's
nation.
right. I had that one written down too. You know, that kind of stood out, you know, God's grace upon this special nation, those who would be his chosen people. What else? Do you see anything else in chapter 4 that kind of stands out as a reference to God's grace?
They heard his voice.
Yeah. Yeah, what a special relationship, you know, that they had. You know, verse 20, you know, mentions that, you know, Moses reminded them how God took you and brought you out of Egypt. Calvin was just reminding us of this, to be the people of his inheritance. Again, just kind of drawing on the point that these were the people that God chose. These were his chosen people. He's extended his grace to them. Do you see anything else?
Verse 40,
Verse 40?
again, the land.
Oh yeah, again, by giving the land. Yeah, the land. There's several expressions like this that it doesn't say grace, but we see that's what it is. Here's God's promises to them. It's his demonstration of love to them. Verse 31 says the Lord your God is a merciful God and will not forget the covenant with you. Again, just says something about the relationship he has with these people, his mercy extended toward them. And just how he made himself known to them. Let's see, on verse 32, chapter 4, verse 32. Chapter 4, verse 32. Ask now about the former days, long before your time, from the day God created man on the earth. Ask from one end of the heavens to the other. Has anything so great ever happened, or has anything like it ever been heard of? Has any other people heard the voice of God speaking out of fire, as you have and lived? Has any God ever tried to take for himself one nation out of another nation by testings, by miraculous signs and wonders, by war, by a mighty hand and outstretched arm, or by a great and awesome deeds like all the things that the Lord your God did for you in Egypt before your very eyes? You were shown these things so that you might know that the Lord is God. Beside him, there is no other. This kind of just brings into point the relationship God wanted to have with these people, the grace that he has extended to them, a very special place they had in the eyes of God. Now,
I think just by virtue of the fact that God gave them the law. God gave them the law. So they would know how to live.
yes,
Know how to conduct themselves and to live righteously. That represented a very special, distinct relationship between God and his people. And Paul addressed that in chapter 3 of the book of Romans when he said, what advantage then does the Jew have? He said, there's great advantage because it was to them it was given the oracles of God.
that's right.
It was that special people.
That's right.
And God gave them his law.
And to draw them nearer to him.
It's interesting talking about this. You almost need to make the comparison, go back to what people think about grace in the New Testament. Clearly, there's love here, and that's kind of what you're saying, not grace, but love. You've done these great things. But then over and over, it says, so you shall consider yourself, or so you shall obey, or so you shall follow. It talks about these good things he did, so you shall do these things that he's told you to do. And people forget that in the New Testament all the time. This isn't grace with no cutoff date to it.
Exactly.
This is because he did these amazing things, so you shall consider yourselves, so you shall obey him. So, and then it still follows up in every one of these, because if you don't,
Right.
bad things are still going to happen.
That's right.
And he repeats it over and over and over again in some way, all through 4, 5, and 6.
Man, this is exactly what I want us to be able to see in the big picture. That I think sometimes we miss. We go to, sometimes we sit down and study with somebody and they're trying to find their way to Christ, or maybe they think they have their way to Christ, and it's all dependent on God's grace and nothing more. Well, if we know the Bible story, we understand that it's never been that way. God's grace is great, and it's there, and it's extended, always has been. But there is always the requirement that we do what he says. And that becomes so clear and so evident with the story of God and the children of Israel. And in Deuteronomy chapter 4, 5, and 6, we see that to become so clear.
Kind of going off what you just said, grace isn't there to be everything. It's there to make up the difference where we cannot be perfect. And so in the next lesson, it talks about legalism and that kind of thing. Like, there's a whole lot of rules and things that God commands of us, like, do the right thing, all the things that he commands of us. We're never going to get it perfect. There's always going to be those things that we stumble over and we can never get right. That's where the grace comes in to make up the difference. Because we don't deserve it.
And well, and if we back up and we just apply that even here back to the children of Israel, did they deserve the land, we asked? No, they didn't deserve that. Did they deserve God's forgiveness over and over again as it took place? Well, no, that was by God's grace and mercy that they received such. Some things I had written down, like Israel found favor with God, though it was not because they deserved it. We see that over and over. If Israel had received what they deserved, they would have never got out of the wilderness, because even in the wilderness they fell down and didn't always obey God. In spite of their past as a nation, God still counted them as his own and was still willing to fulfill his promise. Now, he has not in any way diminished the requirements of their obedience to him, but it's still through his grace that he's offering that. It was not by the resources of Israel that the promised land would be theirs. It was by the provision of God. That hasn't changed. If we try to make another parallel, we think about heaven as the promised land. It's there. It's offered. The provision is made for that. But it's not going to be by our own resources that we enter in. It's by the grace of God and our listening to him and obeying what he says. Third motion.
You mentioned the grace and mercy of God. I think we need to make a distinction between those two things.
Okay.
They're two different things.
Mm-hmm.
When we see the blessings that God gives us, we receive those things because of the grace of God. In other words, we've always heard the statement, grace is what God, when God gives us what we don't deserve.
Mm-hmm.
Now let's attach mercy to that. Instead of giving, mercy withholds. God's grace gives us what we do not deserve.
Mm-hmm.
God's mercy provides what we do deserve.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, it keeps us from having to suffer.
Yeah.
And so there's, I think we did notice the difference.
That's a good point.
Distinction without a difference.
I understand what you're saying. Sometimes,
Two different things.
yeah, you're right. We think of grace and mercy as being exactly the same thing. No, they're not. No, there's some difference there. Are they tied together in some ways? Well, yes, but there is a distinction. I think that you've made that well. You know, it's interesting. You know, most of us, we want God's grace. I mean, we all want God's grace. Someone not too long ago in a study made the comment, in a conversation, I would say, it's like, I want God's grace and mercy. It's there for me. I know I have God's grace and mercy, but I don't need his judgment. I said, well, I'm not sure you can have this and not have this, and yet I've had others say something similar to that. Well, I want God's grace. I know I've received God's grace. I won't have to face his judgment. No, I don't think I can go there. But I understand how the mind gets to that point. I mean, in chapter 4, God's identified as a jealous God. And we've seen with the children of Israel in the Bible story up to this point, even, number of times where God's real. Doesn't take away from his grace. And I think we need to see that even when God's making judgment, that doesn't take away from his grace. But grace doesn't take away from his judgment either. And I understand how we want God's grace, but we cannot avoid his judgment. The story, Bible story as well. And without us going off on too big of a sidetrack here, like I said before, we see so much about grace in the New Testament and the hope we have in Jesus. And by God's grace, we are saved for sure. It doesn't take away the need of our obedience. And when we look at the Old Testament story, I think it helps us to see that God's grace is there. It is offered, but it doesn't take away at all the need of obedience to him.
I did not count these, but I took someone else's word for it, but for 18 times in the book of Deuteronomy, it says, be careful and obey.
Right, exactly. Yeah, and that's about right on the number on that. There's many other references as well. It doesn't use those words. That's still talking about obedience.
The whole Bible's full of conditional statements. It's always if, then.
Mm-hmm.
If you do this, then this will happen. If you don't do this, then this will happen.
And that's exactly what he was saying to Israel, as well. And Moses is now the deliverer of that, for sure. So I just wanted to spend some extra time today on grace. And then that leads us into lesson number 3, if you've picked that up or got that online. I'll also start into lesson 3. And again, we're looking at primarily Deuteronomy chapter 4, 5, and 6. But looking a little more closely here just at obedience and how do we see that in this text. Many of us in this room might remember a time where it just seems to me that obedience, taking out of the biblical context here for a moment, the idea of obedience was something that was understood and appreciated by some a little more than it is now. I mean, when I grew up in school, the word of the teacher and the discretion of the teacher meant a lot. And if the teacher said, don't do that, or here's the punishment, I found that to be very true. You would get your backside warmed up in those days if you disobeyed. And, having some respect for law enforcement and some things like that, a willingness to obey the things that they said as a representative of the government. I mean, I know there have always been those who have pushed the limit. I know there have always been those who have been disobedient to laws or to government or to teachers or to parents. I know that. Boy, it just seems to me like we are in a time where consideration of authority and those who are in charge has just hit a horrible state. And everybody's challenging, who are you to tell me what to do? Kind of an attitude. I know it's not all new, I get that. But it just seems to me that that's a greater challenge these days. And if we think that that attitude does not affect the church, we need to wake up, because it does have an effect. Taking us back again to our text in Deuteronomy. Israel certainly challenged God and his authority. Sometimes quite deliberately, sometimes perhaps it was just not thinking things through. Sometimes it was their fear, it was their lack of faith. Maybe they didn't even think of it at the time as it being a challenge to God's authority, their lack of obedience, but that's what it was. And many are willing to reject the authority of God in obedience to him even today. Still, we go back to this story of old, and we find that there were many long ago that had that attitude. And Israel they were challenged from many different ways and many different directions to leave what God said. The nations all around them and the nations that they traveled around and through the wilderness wanderings as they were approaching the promised land were all nations that worshiped other gods. And that had an effect on them, even the nation that they were brought out of, from Egypt. And it seems like that at least there were some among the people that never just totally, separated themselves from other gods and other religions to serve only Jehovah God. And that was always a challenge for them. And it led to a lot of problems. But God's instructions concerning such thing has always been so simple and so clear. And so what Moses is doing now is he's repeating to them the things that they should have known, what they have heard before, that these calls for obedience. There's a little exercise in your outline, looking at chapter 4. Like, could you find some statements, some calls for obedience that God gave to the children of Israel? Did you find some there? Yeah, you did. Yeah, so if we kind of start at the early part of the chapter, there, like verse 1, I gave you one. The laws and decrees I'm about to teach you, follow them. Okay? What did you find? Give me one. Listen. This is going to be something that is said often. Listen. Parents, how many times to your children have you said, sit down, listen to me? You're trying to get their attention. You try different ways sometimes to get them to kind of focus and look at you. Read my lips, listen to me. And I kind of feel like that's what God is doing with Israel. Okay, we're going to try this again. Listen to me this time. What else do you see? Watch yourself carefully. And the conditions are given to that. Watch yourself. And the consequences are given if you don't listen. What else? Yeah, don't add, don't take away from these commands. Good. What else? There's a lot of them. Joe. Acknowledge. To know, to recognize God for who he is. What else?
Take heed lest you forget.
Take heed lest you forget.
Remember your history.
Yeah.
What you've been told and what you went through.
Remember where you've come from. You ever hear that growing up? I'm afraid only old folks have. I was told that more than most, I think. Remember who you are, kind of a thing.
Verse 13 says that declare to you as a covenant, commanded you to perform.
Yeah, commanded you to follow these things. Remember the commands God gave you and commanded you to follow them. Remember those. 39, what do you got?
Let therefore today take it to your heart that the Lord, he is God, and God alone on the earth below. There is no other.
There is no other God. Over and over again. You can find a dozen or more. You can find 15 or more. Statements that in some way or another, demonstrates the idea of obedience, God's call for obedience. It's interesting. We talked about grace for a good period of time. And yet there's not really a lot of direct statements about God's grace. We see that attribute there. And even today, when we talk about in the New Testament, the Bible talks about grace a little bit more and using the word grace in that way. And that's what people want to key in on. But just like in this text, how many more times in the Old Testament are we compelled to obey? Do you think about that?
Grace started out the very beginning because he told Adam and Eve when they ate the fruit, they would surely die. But he allowed them to go on and live and create more humans to continue the human race rather than just wiping it out.
We might see and say that we can see God's grace even with Adam and Eve and what he gave and what he offered them. At the same time, we see the results of disobedience and God's response to that. Next week, Lord willing, I'd like us to work some more here on lesson 3. I don't think we'll spend the whole time here, but I know we might see what comments you have. I hope it was a good exercise, just kind of working through this, looking at demonstrations of God's grace. I really want us to see demonstrations of God's call for obedience as well to the children of Israel. Lesson number 3 is a lesson to work on. Lesson number 4 is available too. It's out in the hallway. Be sure you pick that up. We may get into that next week. We might not. I'm just not sure yet. We'll see how discussion goes right here. But I appreciate today your participation, your good comments. Thank you for being here.